Hello and welcome. We're going to go through a GeoFracs walkthrough so we can kind of understand how GeoFracs works. So let's just open our preferences and make sure our file paths are in order so we can access the asset library. Go down here and select GeoFracs, and then we can see it opens up. So you can see on the left hand side that we have kind of like all the category shapes, so kind of like the base shapes and then some presets that are made from them. And you'll notice that there is a yellow and a blue version of kind of like this default shape. So we'll go through that a little bit later. But there is one thing to note: if you want kind of the nodes that are on kind of all these objects in your scene, you can just drag this guy out and you'll have the list of nodes on the side that you can kind of use to build on your own objects. So let's first kind of go into a pre-built GeoShape and just kind of see what it's like. So this is a relatively simple one. Let's turn on the shade mode or look dev. And then we're also going to turn on the wireframe. I like to do this just so I can see just the geometry a little bit better. So there we have it. We can see all the breaks in the geometry. And let's jump over to our modifier stack. And so we can see that GeoFracs is set up with a series of modifiers. So we have this top node, which is always going to kind of be the base shape. An important part of GeoFracs is the output attributes. And these are basically on all the nodes. And that's how we're going to select a lot of the geometry that we're going to choose to extrude. So on this one, we can see even and odd is there. I don't know if I utilize it in this particular one. So if we open the GeoFracs geometry node, we can see there's a lot of parameters here. Let's just go through bit by bit. So this top half, from extrude scale down to scale individual, this is how we extrude and manipulate the extrusions of our mesh. And then everything below that, activate masks, are kind of like the masks or selections, depending on how you think about it, of the geometry. So it's different ways that we can select the geometry and choose where to extrude. So let's just piece this one together. I usually like to turn off all the layers from top to bottom. All right, so we can see that the first extrusion is this. We're just going to leave the material on so we can see kind of a better shade of it. So we can see that this is a pretty simple, straightforward first node right here. It's just extruding this part, and we can scale the extrusion with this. And there's also another thing we can do. We can, turn off whether it's going to be individual or the entire connected mesh. And there's also iteration. So if we click iterate, we can go up to 10 iterations, and this basically duplicates these parameters that many times. So we're extruding the mesh 10 times from the face. So some cool things we can do with that. Let's just drop this back down to 1, which was the default. And we're not going to go into the selections quite yet. And then we're just going to turn on this second layer and see how that does. So this just adds like a second kind of bevel to this. And then the third layer adds another extrusion, and then the fourth kind of adds another inner extrusion on the side. So let's look at layers 3 and 4. So 3 and 4 are actually using these masks. So if it's a 0, it's going to turn off the mask. If it's a 1, it's going to turn on the masks. And then if we want to have a selection transfer, so we're transferring the selection of the geometry to this kind of new node, then we turn it to 1, and then we can choose top 1. So how did this choose top 1? So if we look in this list of attributes, we can see that top 1 is one of the selections, and that is actually coming from the first GeoFrac. So if we go down kind of to the bottom, go to output attributes, we can see top 1, side 1, both 1. So then we can target different areas of the extrusion, whether it's the top of the extrusion, the side, or both together if we wanted to. So that is what 3 is looking at. So it's just looking at the top of the first one. And there's obviously a lot more parameters down here that we can mess with if we wanted to, but we're just going to do that for now. And then we can see 4 is actually selecting the sides of the first extrusion. So that's where the first extrusion sides come in. And then if we go down to material 1, We can see that we're just using a base material, so this isn't really using any of the selection attributes. And then if we go down to material layer 2, we're just going to make sure that the viewport and render buttons are checked. And then we're just looking here. So we can see that we're choosing a second material, we're activating the masks, and then we're using the top selection to color it. So pretty straightforward. And then below that, we have our scene helper. So this is an important thing to kind of take note of. So if we put this object down to 0, just put it 0, 0, 0, kind of reset the origin, right? We can see that it's basically centered on the origin, top and bottom, but with the scene helper, if we turn that on, we can actually ground it. So it's always going to be on the ground plane, or at least the origin will be. So if we mess with this ground offset, we can move it kind of above or below the ground. And this is helpful because if we had, let's say, a sphere, and we wanted to rotate this object, so we're just going to close these windows real quick, and we're just going to rotate it. So we have ground offset to 1, and then we can rotate this, and it's always going to be, its lowest point is always going to be touching the, I guess, the origin of the object. So this is just a nice way to kind of keep it in your scene, acting how you want. There's some other things we can do with this. For instance, let's just drag this one up. So we're just going to put this down to 0. And what we can do, we can go to object reference, click on that, and we're going to do target the geometry that we just pulled in. And then I'm just going to put this right kind of lined up with that. And then, so you can see that they're overlapping right now, but if we go to object on object Z, so it's basically looking at the Z of the object, and then it's going to kind of place it on basically the top of the geometry of that object. So this is a way that we can stack geometry. So if we happen to move this or change the size of this, the geometry will kind of stick to the top. So this is just a nice way to be able to stack geometry without having to rearrange it every time you wanted to adjust it. So that was a very quick overview, but what we're going to do now, rather than going through every preset, I encourage you to do that just to kind of see what has happened. We're going to build our own. And this is, I haven't trial run this, I'm just going to kind of do it because it is actually pretty easy. All right, so we're going to start with one of my favorite ones, and this is the sphere hollow. So we're going to start with the yellow one, not the mod one. We'll go over the mod one later. So we're just going to center it on its axis and then make sure that all the layers are pretty much turned off. We probably don't need this geo delete. We can go over that later. It just deletes geometry based off of certain parameters. So yeah, we're just going to leave the material layer on and the first GeoFracs layer on. Cool. So first, let's just kind of set this up. So we want maybe fewer rings, lesser rings. And if we open the output attributes, we can see that there's a base inner. So we can select the inner part of this sphere. So let's see how that works. So we have this kind of this default extrude going on. We're not going to get into these quite yet. We're going to go down to mask, turn that on. And you can see once we turn it on, it doesn't select anything, but because it's basically has nothing to select. So we're just going to go to selection 1 and we're going to choose base inner. And you can see that it chooses the inner part of the base. I can go and choose base outer, and it chooses the outer part of the base. So you can bring in your own custom objects and have different selections set up. We have even segments, so this is only going to select the even part of those meshes. So yeah, pretty straightforward with that. So let's just go to base outer. So we just want to select the outer part of this. And you know what, maybe we also want to just select the lower part of this bottom. So what we can do, we can go into this advanced masking. So if we go over to, let's say, position math type, so we're just going to make selections based off of the position of the mesh in the different faces. So when it's 0, it's off. When it's 1, it's actually adding. So we're taking this selection here, the base outer, and we're going to add to it. There's also two other evaluations we can do. We can do 2, which would be a multiply. So it's like this selection and one of these selections, or we can do a subtraction, which would mean this selection minus whatever we choose here. But we're just going to do, actually, yeah, we are going to do a minus. So let's go over to 3. And then we're going to go to Z position. So I only want to select the bottom. So if we slide on this thing, I'm actually going to increase the geometry up here just so we can see kind of more what it's selecting. So we're just going to scroll back down to here. And then we're going to mess with the Z, not the Z center, the Z. So it's basically looking at the Z axis, and we can start to select things higher or lower. So if we can see, if we go above 1, it goes from top to bottom, and if we go below 1, it goes from bottom to top. So if we want to select only things on the bottom, let's go about that. Okay, I like that. And you can see here that we have kind of this thin geometry. So I could go up to this and change the whole size so it's a little bit bigger. Or what I could do, I'm just going to leave it, we'll just leave it like that for now. Another selection we have is the radial selection. So just imagine this as a cylinder basically on the Z axis. So I'm going to go to subtract. So we're going to go to 3 again on the radial math type. And then let's go and select the slider. And we're just going to kind of slide it up until we cut off that lower part of the mesh there, the smaller part. Cool. And there's also another way we could have done that, right? So let's just turn that off just for demonstrational purposes. We could also select by face area. So if we go up just one more, we can go to face area math type, change that to 3. Now we're going to go down the face area and we're just going to slide it to the left. And you can see that it kind of very quickly deselects the smaller faces. So if we wanted to deselect the larger faces, we could go from 0 to 1, but we're just going to go select the smaller faces. So there we go. So now whatever we do, we're just going to be affecting this part of the geometry. And then this GeoFrac will output these attributes, which we will reference on the following GeoFracs. So we're just going to remember top 1, side 1, and both 1 are things that we can use. So let's just go back up. Now that we have the selection set, we can now extrude. So we can make it extrude a little bit longer. We can bring it in just so we can have a little bit of tapering going on. We also can add some iterations. So why don't we just bump that up a little bit. And so after you have some iterations, you can then see what some of these attributes down here, these modifiers will do. So it's basically manipulating the extruded geometry. So I'm going to go to extrude offset iterations. So this is going to tell Blender or the geometry nodes, okay, I want to affect 6 of them, or I want to affect 3 of them. So it's just going to affect the first 3 iterations. So let's see what that does. So I'm just going to hold, click and drag, select both the X and the Y axis, and I'm just going to drag out. You can see that it's affecting only the first 3 iterations. So it's kind of like making like an octopus looking thing. It's kind of cool. All right, so I like that. And then we could do something else. So we could do rotate iterations. So I'm just going to boost this up all the way to 6. So we're going to affect every one of them. And there's 2 type of kind of selection. We can center it on the normal, or we can just center it on the default position. We could rotate it X, Y, probably not in this case. Usually when it's like a symmetrical on the Z axis, I just rotate on the Z. So then we can kind of rotate the arms of this so-called octopus, and now we have kind of a cool looking sun-like thing going on. And at any point we can go up here and we can, you know, add additional segments to this. So if we wanted more arms in this octopus, perfect. Now it's not an octopus anymore. Cool. So we'll just bring that down to 8. So it really is an octopus. Wonderful. Okay, and so that's all we're going to do for the first layer. Okay, so just to review, the first layer extrudes the base outer with a subtraction on the Z. So we're not subtracting everything on the base outer. And then with a subtraction of face area, so we're not affecting smaller faces. So that's essentially how GeoFracs works. It's just targeting certain faces and making some cool extrusions from them. So let's go down to the second layer. So now that we're on the second layer, we can think about what we want to target. So let's target, well, let's first turn it on. It's important to turn it on. Obviously, we don't want to target everything. So let us select let's select both 1. Okay, so I have both 1 selected, so that's selecting everything that we just extruded. And I'm also going to add to it. You'll understand the logic to this soon. So we're just going to go to base inner and we're going to add that to it. But I don't want that. I want the inverse of that selection. So I'm just going to inverse everything I just kind of selected. So there we have it. Also, I don't want this this bottom part right here. I'll use that top part just fine. So what I'll just do, I'll go down to this position. And I'm going to change this to a 3 again, and also on the Z, not the Z center. The Z center goes from the center of the object and kind of goes out in both directions, but we don't want that. We just want the Z. So we're just going to go slide it a little bit that way, and we don't have that selected. Super cool. All right. So now I'm going to extrude this a little bit. Do I want to go inner or outer? I guess we can do inner. Let's just see how that goes. All right, I'm just going to add a few iterations, and I don't actually. Okay, so we can see that this top part's not going how I want it to. All right, so I'm just going to go down the Z center, and I'm going to slide it from left to right. So this is selecting from the top and bottom, but since I'm subtracting it, I think I went too far, so just about right there. All right, perfect. Cool, so yeah, we can move on to our next layer, and we can add as many layers here as we want to. I just have it set to 4. If you want to set up more, we will go over that. All right, so this next, I don't want to select everything, so let's go down here, turn on masks. And I'm going to choose top 2. So it's looking at the top extrusion of the second layer we just did. So now I can do that. And let's see. So let's extrude out there. And this is just a simple extrusion. We're just going to do this for now, just for demonstrational purposes. All right, we're actually going to add a few iterations to this. We'll add 2 iterations and then bring in the scale just ever so slightly. Cool. And we'll just go down to the 4th layer, make sure we turn it on. And then we're going to extrude the top 3. Actually, no, we're going to do side 3. Okay, and you can see that it extrudes all the geometry. However, I don't want that. So we're going to go down to the radial math type. We're going to change this to subtract. And then we are going to change this from 2D to 3D. So instead of kind of using a cylinder as a selection, we're going to use a sphere. So we're going to start from the inside out. And you can see as we scoot along, we're kind of selecting everything from a radial point of view, basically the center of the object. So yeah, just like that. Perfect. Okay, so now we're just gonna mess with this extrusion a little bit so it's not quite as big. There we go. And what we can do, we can come back up here and we can actually edit the scale of the extrusion. So We want to affect all the iterations, and let's just maybe bring that in. You can see if we bring that in, it no longer selects it based off of the radial select. So just keep that in mind. So I'm actually going to come down here and select a little bit more of that extrusion that we just made. Cool deal. All right, so now what we are going to do is we're going to add the next one. So all we have to do if we wanted to add another layer is we can just duplicate it by hitting Shift D, or we could go up and hit duplicate on this part. Just duplicate that. I usually like to call this just GeoFracs number 5 in sequential order, so we can kind of keep track of everything. We're just going to go down here and make sure that we rename these to 5. So on each one of these, we want to just change it so we can select it later if we want. And let's go to, so it's going to duplicate everything that we just did in that last section. So we can just kind of set it back to default. And let's choose the inside now. So let's go to base inner. So you can just type in inner or base, pop up. So we can see we have that. Excellent. So now we can scale what's on the inside. And we also can select, let's go to position mask. So make sure the mask is on, which it is. And we're going to add so we could add the X position. Actually, we're going to subtract because we don't want something. So we could cut it away from the Y. You can see that we can bring it from the Y or the X, but we're also just going to do the Z center again. So we're just going to go from the center. So not all of them are selected. Cool deal. And then we're just going to go up to the iterations and bump that up to, it's too small, hope a scale. Let's do 4, and then the extrude will just 0.03. Okay, yeah, we can do that. So kind of a cool little pattern on the inside, and rotation iterations. Let's do that. So we'll just bump that up to 4 because we want to affect everything. And on the Z-axis, we can just kind of rotate it. And you can see if you change the center on normal, it's just a slightly different effect. Probably not the effect that we want. So we'll just leave it like that for now. So yeah, we got some pretty interesting shape. I'm just going to do one more. I think we can do something cool to this bottom part. So let us just duplicate this one more time. Oh, the wrong thing. So let's take this, GeoFracs 5, duplicate, call it GeoFracs 6. And we're going to just do the good habit and rename it right away so we don't forget. And we want to turn that to 0. And we want to make sure this is all set to default so we're not affecting anything we don't want to. Rather than iterations, we're turning off all the iterations, and we're actually going to do a little bit of inward extrude and then set this to a point like 9. Okay. Now we kind of have like a plated look to those arms. Interesting. And let's go down to the material. So material layer, we just have a base on it. Not going to mess with that. Material layer 2, we can start to select certain things. So let's say I wanted to add to my selection. So I'm just going to activate these masks, choose this to material B so we can see kind of the blue. And then turn on selection transfer. And we have, we do base inner. So if we select that, we can see that the inner part is blue. I think that's pretty cool. And then we're going to also choose so we're going to choose add. We want to add to it. We'll choose side 6. So what we just did. Cool deal. And then we're going to add, we could do some randomness. So if we turn this to 1, and then this is basically a percentage. So what percent of the mesh do I want to select? So it's selecting all the different faces. If I go over all the way to 1, it's going to be 100%. I could do that, but I don't want to. That's only for certain circumstances. So we have the inner, we have that, and let's see. So we could just add another layer. Say we wanted to select some of these other elements. We could just do a material layer 3. All right, so we have these selected by default. Let's just choose both 3, and there you have it. So we have kind of a cool looking thing here, and maybe we don't want that inner part like we did last time. So we can just go down to radial selection, subtract. We don't need this side 6, and then we can turn it to radial, and then select from the inside out. But we don't want that. We want the inverse of that. So we're just going to go on the other selection. So like that. Ta-da! So cool. So this is something that we made pretty quickly. If I wasn't talking over it, I could probably make it faster. But there you have it. We got our first kind of GeoFrac shape. What we could do, we could save that as a preset if we wanted to. So what we're going to do now, we're just going to pull another shape, but we're going to pull a blue one, and we're going to see how that can work differently. So let's just go for the cone. Let's go for the cone. And as always, I like to look at the output attributes to see what we kind of have pre-selected for us that we can start manipulating. Okay, so let's just kind of change some of these parameters, make it a little taller. Less vertices. Let's just go for 5. Radius top, we can do something like that. Then we can, stretch it if we wanted to, but not necessary. Dual mesh if we wanted to. Ooh, yeah, let's do that. Okay, so now that we have that, so this is going to be a different approach. This is kind of more modular in a way. Also a little lighter in some of these nodes, but in order to select things, we will have to add some new nodes. So I like to drag this one into our scene so we just have all the nodes available to us to pull in. And yeah, so this one works similar, but a little bit different. There's some interesting new things on this method. So we could choose a selection. We could just click this and turn it into selection, but since we turn it into a dual mesh, these output attributes just no longer apply because it kind of changed the mesh. So it's only by the default mesh. But I like this shape, so we're just going to stick with that for now, and we can start by extruding. So I only want to select the top part. How do I do that? I can just duplicate one of these nodes, drag it here, and then I'm going to type in mod. I'm going to choose the position, or axis mod, I should say. So we're just be able to select things by the axis of the geometry. So I'm going to have everything selected. Math type 0 is not right, so I want to change that to 3. And then I'm just going to bring up the Z position. And we're not going to be able to see anything because this isn't actually applied. So what we have to do is we have to go to the output, and we're just going to type in Z POS for position. So if we go down here to our selection, I can click that and type in Z POS, select it, and then we can see what we're actually doing. So I want it just like that. I just want to select the top. Cool deal. And then also what we can do, add iterations. And there's like a new little thing that I added, which is the inset. So it's going to be insetting each extrusion. So you can kind of have like a stepped extrusion approach. And you also can see if we go to output attributes that there are a fair amount more things we can select. So we can select the different iterations of the extrusion here. And let's go into that. So we just kind of take note of the naming convention. We have for the iteration side, we have it, A1, A2, down to A10. All right, so each layer has a different naming for the iteration, so A, B, C. But we'll get into that a little bit, actually real soon. So let's just go down to mod 2. We're just going to turn that on. And now what we want to do is we want to select an iteration. But say we want to select multiple iterations, we only can select one here. So if I type in like A5, we can select the 5th iteration, which is the very end. But like I said, we want to select more than one. So what we're going to do is we're just going to duplicate this node again, bring it up, and we're going to type in mod, and we want to choose mod selection. It's a good practice to just rename these so you know what it is. Just going to close these up so we're not getting overwhelmed with open things here. So I'm just going to go ahead and click on these icons right here, which turn them into attributes. And then I'm going to click these into ones so we can add. We don't need to add all of them, but let's just start with iteration 2. So I'm just going to type in A2, select that, and then also A4. Okay, we need to select the output. So let's just choose, we'll just call this iteration, or iter for short, 1. We can call it whatever we want. Be creative, be specific. It is up to you. All right, so now we can see that I'm only selecting the 2nd and 4th iteration. So when we make these adjustments here, so we can adjust the individual or the collective. And if I wanted to invert that, I could just simply invert that, but I don't want to. So extrusion, let's bring that out. The extrusion ratio, so if we had multiple iterations, we could have it extrude at a different rate, so they actually get kind of smaller extrudes as they go out. But we'll just leave that at 1 for now, and we're actually going to take this to 1 because we want multiple iterations. And then we also have the scale, so we can scale, and we also can scale the iterations, so we can have it kind of taper off pretty quickly if we prefer. So if we had more iterations, we can have it taper off nicely. There we have it. So something kind of cool there. So now we're going to take, I guess we could inset this as well. Yeah, that looks pretty cool. So on the 3rd layer, what we want to do, we want to target the other 3 iterations. So there's a few ways we can do that, but we're just going to go, so we just duplicated the selection mod, and then we're going to just choose, let's choose a 3 and a 5. All right, so now we're just going to call this iter2. Type in iter2 on the selection here. And now we're selecting those 2. So we can have a different extrusion going on. So I'm just going to close this up, rename this to selection 2. And then let's see what we can do. So we can extrude it out. We can scale it in. All right. There's also an advanced method. So it's kind of taking those transformations that we can do from kind of the approach 1. All right, with the advanced tab open, we can just make sure the extrude is not as extreme, and then we can go to translate iterations, change that to 3 because that's how many iterations we have. But if we only wanted to choose, let's make 4 iterations, and we'll still only select 3 here. And then when we expand this, we're only expanding those first 3, but maybe we only want to expand on the first one. So we're basically kind of changing, like translating as in moving those points. So there you have it, something interesting. All right, so now I'm just going to go down to mod 4, make sure we turn this on. And I have that Z position attribute that I can select. However, I don't want that. I just want the inverse of that. So now we can affect the bottom. So let's see what we can do. Let's add some iterations and scale. All right, but I also want to add some advanced modifications to it. So I'm going to translate how many iterations. Let's say 5. So it's basically moving those iterations. I'm going to move it on the z-axis. So we're just going to kind of move it down like that. And then we can scale them as well. Let's move that. We'll just affect 5. Select the X and Z axis, and then we can pull those out. Maybe we want to affect only a few. So maybe just 2. There we go. Then if we wanted to add another mod, we could. So just duplicate that. Just going to change this to the regular one. Make sure that we rename things. So the only downside of this particular one is that you would have to go through and rename kind of all these. All right, so we have all those renamed now, and now we just want to select the sides of number 4. But we have the invert, so change that. Sides of number 4, we can bring that in to be like a little bit of extrusion. And we're also, actually, I don't want sides 4 exactly, so I'm just going to come up here, duplicate this node, and we're going to change this to a radial one. So mod radial. I'm going to say sides 4. I'm going to give this a name of radial. And make sure we change this down here so we can kind of see what we're doing. So now what I want to do is I want to subtract from this. And I just want to select, I don't want to select the inside. So yeah, we're just going to select it just like that. So it's trying to make, it's basically making a cylinder of this selection. So only the outsides, I like that. And let's just extrude it a little bit more. So the more iterations we have, the more it will kind of scale up. I want it quite like that. Here we go. And then, yeah, I think that's kind of the gist of it. So what we can do now, we can then kind of shade it a different color. So we have material mod, and how this works a little bit differently. So we have our base material, and then we have our second material, material A. Let's select the, let's see, we're going to select the inset of side 1. You can see that it selects kind of all those insides. And then we also want to do the inset of side 2. You got to select the material for it. You can obviously choose different materials like that. Okay. And then we're just going to do one more selection, all 5. Change that to yellow. There we go. So there you have it. So we have another kind of interesting shape. You can probably go faster if you wanted to. So yeah, we made some pretty cool shapes in not much time at all. The more you practice, the more you get into it, the quicker you can make these shapes. And yeah, I encourage you to just dive into them and play around as much as you want, and you can make some really cool things.